everyone, welcome back to another episode of Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. My name's Al Horner, and today, guys, we're blasting off to the distant planet of Pandora. That's right, Avatar: The Way of Water, you might have heard of it, is James Cameron's long-awaited sequel to one of the biggest movies of all time. And on this week's show, I'm joined by two of its incredibly talented co-writers. You might know Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver as the screenwriting pair behind the brilliant Planet of the Apes reboot trilogy, not to mention 2015's Jurassic World. If you're familiar with those movies, you'll probably be able to understand exactly why Cameron chose them as collaborators for this follow-up to his epic 2009 sci-fi fantasia. Both of them, not unlike Avatar, wove clever social commentary on man's exploitation of the natural world into exciting set pieces and massive spectacle. Where the first Avatar was beautiful in its simplicity, The Way of Water is a much more complex beast. It has a number of moving parts and interlocking storylines, some of which are seeds for films to come. This is actually the first in a number of sequels that Amanda and Rick have worked on in production now. The film picks up with our heroes from the first movie, Jake Sully, played by Sam Worthington, and Neytiri, played by Zoe Saldana, fighting another epic fight 14 years after the Battle of the Hallelujah Mountains, Parenthood. The pair have had a family and now have an even more pronounced reason to protect their land from the colonisers from Earth, who are seeking to make Pandora humanity's new home, having wrecked their own. Rick and Amanda, who've been married since 1989 and working together since 1992's The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, told me all about how The Way of Water came together on the page. In the conversation you're about to hear, we get into how they, Cameron, and fellow co-writer Josh Friedman brought certain characters back from the dead. We talk about the Mowgli-esque origins of Spider, one of the film's most fascinating new additions to the series, and the environmental truths about our own climate change-stricken world that the film takes aim at. There's also a thorough breakdown of that death in the film's final act, and I even attempt to speak the language of the Na'vi. Needless to say, it doesn't go great. This is the part where I normally tell you that what you're about to hear is a spoiler conversation, so don't listen if you haven't seen Avatar: The Way of Water yet. The box office receipts for this film suggest that if you're listening, there's a high chance you've already checked it out. It's nearing $2 billion at the time of recording. All the same, I'll repeat it anyways. If you haven't yet seen Avatar: The Way of Water, you may want to hit pause, go away and catch the film in cinemas now, then come back as we dive into every plot point in this incredible movie. A huge thank you as ever to our Patreon community for helping make this episode possible. Head to patreon.com/scriptapart if you'd like to get involved there. Okay, with no further ado, this is the wonderful Amanda Silver and Rick Jaffa on the first draft secrets of Avatar: The Way of Water. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Hey guys, such an enormous pleasure to have you with us on Script Apart. I did actually Google how to say hello in Na'vi. Let me see. Kalktik. I think I'm probably mispronouncing that, and James Cameron is listening somewhere and wanting to throw his phone against the wall or something in frustration.
Well, he's here right now, so let's bring him in. I think you nailed it. I think
you nailed it too. Did. I mean, I'm not, my Navi's a little rusty.
It's a little rusty.
But I think that was really good.
Well, it's a delight to have you with us, not just because I loved Avatar: The Way of Water, which we'll be breaking down in detail today, but because Jurassic World, the Planet of the Apes movies, these are joyously smart examples of blockbuster entertainment that manage to both thrill and have something to say. I love all these films. I wanted to start off by asking what you think the shared DNA might be between a lot of these recent projects that you've worked on, guys, beyond obviously their huge success at the box office. It seems like the reverence towards nature that's in The Way of Water and the film's fury towards those that mess with nature, that's alive in Jurassic, that's alive in Planet of the Apes. Is it a coincidence that environmentalism is something that's ended up spilling into your work a lot over the last decade or so?
I don't think it is a coincidence, but on the other hand, it wasn't something that we actually sat down and planned or mapped out in terms of our careers. And so with the first Planet of the Apes, with Rise of the Planet of the Apes, it really just started off as a character piece, which I think is also part of the shared DNA, but we can get back to that later if you want to. But it was really a character piece. And there was a point, though, we were in the middle of the first draft when I said to Amanda, I said, man, I don't know if this movie's going to get made or not, but if it does, there's going to be a lot of primates really pulling for us, because we realized suddenly it's a bit of it's an animal rights movie.
Which is something we believed in.
We do,
kind of
very
came
much
into the
so.
work, but we didn't write it in order to make a point. It kind of grew out of the passion that we were bringing to the character and of Caesar and his situation.
Yeah. So, and it's the same, with Way of the Water. You don't really set out. I mean, Jim might have a slightly different answer, but for us, we certainly believed in what we were saying wholeheartedly in terms of environmentalism and the human, destruction of it, or certainly mishandling and so forth. But it does. You can't have your heart on your sleeve. You just have to write really toward emotion and character. And I think it's about finding emotional truth, and then from that, if the message gets across, then that's great. What do you think?
I think that's a really
I mean, that's in terms of that. Yeah, we are animal lovers in this house, and we've been involved with a wolf sanctuary and an apes sanctuary, and other kinds of environmental nonprofits, and so we do we really do believe in it. But again, we never really mapped. I think it's just kind of happened. I think everybody writes from what they love and what they know and what they believe, and it bubbles into the work, or filters into the work.
That's so nice. And just on cue there, as you were talking about your love for animals, there was a dog in the background there.
Yeah. Oh, really? Because we don't have dogs. That's weird.
You kind of touched on it there a little bit. There's something extraordinary about all of those franchises that we just mentioned. In Jurassic, Apes, and now The Way of Water, your antagonists are often human, and our empathy as an audience is with the creature, the alien, the outsider. Logic suggests that as humans, we're wired to root for the home team, if you like, but time and time again, you've managed to place our empathy as an audience in the thing that man is out to destroy within that story. And where do you think that came from as just a storytelling quirk of your movies?
I'm not sure what the origin of it was. I think that the idea of I think it began with Apes.
Oh, it definitely
that
did.
We began exploring this,
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that there would be rooting interest for and relatability to a different species seemed like a wonderful story to tell, and the right way to reboot the Apes franchise, but a way to stretch. I think science fiction in general is a way to stretch human empathy towards the other, allow humans to understand what makes them human, and also to explore struggles and prejudices and difficulties through the lens of another, and to truly put yourself in another's point of view. So we started with this kind of passionate love of Caesar. We wanted to explore what it would mean. When we began with Caesar, he was kind of a Pinocchio figure, like he wanted to be a real boy. And so we followed him. He didn't start as a revolutionary. He started wanting to be one of us.
Yeah. I mean, our pitch, I don't know if it's our original pitch or we just came to understand it in the writing, but it was with Caesar, it was Pinocchio to Moses. And that was his character journey. And that was it. It's like we could land on that, whether it's one movie or three movies, Pinocchio to Moses. So I look, again, it goes back to, and Amanda talked about, rooting interest and the audience's emotional investment in a character. So, and so that's kind of what we try to do. And it doesn't really matter ultimately if it's an animal or a human or an alien, whatever it is. You keep an eye on where the audience is emotionally at all times. And so on Jurassic, when we met with Stephen, we had a very general meeting, and he threw out some, incredible ideas and wonderful ideas about rebooting it and so forth. And then when we went back to him, we said, like, the challenge here, the goal for us, this is at the very early stage, is if we can get rooting interest for an emotional investment in velociraptors. Like some of the, velociraptors, like the biggest villains in those first three, scariest, terrifying. And if we can turn that around, that would be a wonderful thing. It's a real reason to try to tackle the script and so forth. So it does get down to characters and where the audience is in terms of their investment in them.
Just so we have a baseline for how you typically work before we move on to the situation with James, which I understand was quite a different scenario. I think I read that you regularly get story ideas from articles that you've snipped out of newspapers and printed from the internet that you'll either kind of crank to some extreme or you'll combine with another idea from another article. In the case of Planet of the Apes, I think you did both, Rick. I believe you were on a little solo trip with a stack of articles that you collected over a matter of weeks. You mapped them out on the floor, and then you lit up when you pieced one about like a pet chimp next to another about genetic engineering. That was the spark for that movie. Is that still your process? And what else do you do when you're in that ideation phase looking for inspiration?
Yeah, the thing about all those articles, they were articles that we had read and liked over a period of years. I mean, not just weeks. So it's like
you're really holding on to those.
The first, I don't remember how long it'd been, but the first article we had read was about a chimp that was raised as a real boy, as a child in a household who, hits puberty and hormonally goes ape, if you will, and so anyway, we talked about that, and he attacks his own.
Yeah, I mean, he's really destructive.
Oh yeah,
and he's a beloved member of the household, but he wreaks havoc because he's reached puberty, and as Rick said, it's his natural journey to. I mean, apes at a certain age can get very violent.
They do, and there's lots of stories like that, and so we thought for years, well, that would be a really fascinating movie, but we couldn't.
Thriller. We thought it was
thriller.
A thriller.
Yeah, we couldn't figure it out, and then it was the process of the genetic engine. The stacks just happened to be next to each other. So, but we had been clipping out articles and reading things for years on that. So, is that still our process? It really depends. We still read a lot. We read nonfiction. We read the newspaper every day, cover to cover. We try to read magazines that are in areas of interest to us. And so still, if something's, pops an idea, we'll keep track of it. And then sometimes, I guess it's similar to the Apes thing, but sometimes we'll be reading. In fact, this just happened. We've been working on an idea for years, science fiction thriller idea, and we haven't quite cracked it. And the answer's out there somewhere, So sometimes, you'll read an article. Oh yeah, this may really help this other project. And then you have that article, and then you realize, well, no, they're never going to marry those two ideas. It's just not possible. But then you go ahead and keep this other idea because something sparked the idea. So at any rate, and then also we find that once we commit to a project, the universe suddenly starts finding these articles for you, the research for you. So if you're going to do, something on, wolves, for example, every time you open the paper, there's a story about, a wolf killing in Montana, or a gray wolf showed up in California for the first time in 100 years, or, things like that. And so it's really weird.
Or an article about ancient man and wolves.
And wolves, yeah.
All of a sudden you feel like, because I know this sounds kind of spooky, but when it comes to a really solid story, it's you don't feel like you're making it up. You feel like you're uncovering it. You feel like you're finding it, like the story already exists, but you're just on the trail of it. So you got to keep digging, and you kind of know when you're digging in the wrong area, or you come up with something that isn't right. But you also know when you find that right moment that you've been looking for.
Yeah. The other thing these articles do for us is that, especially if you're writing about something that's not part of your own experience, so it lends an authenticity to the work, which is really important because, one of the, I think the most fun aspect of what we do, or part of the process, is the research we do. And we do a ton of it, reading, watching, film, if that's appropriate, whether it's a documentary or just another movie. That's
whatever we can find.
But if you don't do the actual research, then suddenly you realize you're basing it on a television show that you watched or someone else's research,
So how much of that typical process were you able to bring over to this very specific project, working with James, who has a very particular way of working?
Well, one of the things, there's something called Pandorpedia. I don't know if you're
I've heard of this, yeah.
But it's defines everything on Pandora, but also, I guess, the RDA, the human,
everything. Avatar.
Jim Cameron knows every rivet on every spaceship. He knows how the ships are built. He knows the botany. He knows about the tides and the gaseous mixtures in the air. And so we went to Avatar boot camp at first, learning about Avatar land. And we also studied the original movie, and we talked a lot about what was that kind of numinous quality. Mm-hmm. That's what Jim calls it. Mm-hmm. That kind of feeling of awe that the audience has seeing the movie, and the original movie, and we talked about how to try and tap into that for this one. So that's where we kind of started before we even thought about moving forward, to be really educated, to have our feet firmly planted on Pandora.
Yeah. Just the word research, but we did just a ton of research on all of it. And, for example, I think you mentioned the tides, but, since the way of water ends up dealing with the water and the ocean and tides, like we studied, like what would the gravitational forces on Pandora, how would that affect tides and tidal locks? And I mean, so Jim was very adamant that everything be real scientifically, oh yeah. So I don't want to lean too far into that, because the truth is, and maybe we'll get to this, but the mantra was character and emotion the whole time, character. So, but having said that, in terms of this question, we did an enormous amount of research and reading and discussion, and it's interesting. After a while, you start to wonder, well, maybe Pandora's it's kind of like the Twilight Zone. It's like, wait a minute. So is that flower in our backyard, or is it in Jake's? Is it beneath the home tree? What, and you really start to lose a grip on reality.
But the idea is that the life on Pandora for Jake Sully and the Sully family and whatever other characters we meet is real. It's an alternate reality, and it has to feel real on all the different levels.
Yeah. And then the same with the RDA, like how long can they go without breathing?
Ardmore, Selfridge, or the Selfridge.
How do those exoskeletons work and all that stuff?
The guns, that stuff too, the hardware.
There's a story I've heard about how when James brought on board his writers for these Avatar sequels, he handed them Pandorpedia, yes, this giant dossier of all his thoughts on every aspect of the world of Avatar. And one of the things he asked of his collaborators was to digest all that information, then go away and come up with an idea to kind of get things started. A character, an animal, a plot beat, it could be anything. Can you remember what it was that you put forward that day to kind of help win James's trust, if that story is indeed true?
It wasn't really like that. I mean, I love the question so much. I mean, the idea that we would add to the future Pandorpedia and that we did in the room, but it didn't happen when we were at the top. At the top, he kind of cast the room, meaning he figured out which writers he wanted in there with him. And then we all went to boot camp together. And it was after that we began creating new stuff. But did you want to jump in?
I'm just trying to remember if, I think the greatest thing that he did in the beginning was, he had been collecting notes for years and ideas about what the sequels would be, and even stuff that wasn't in the first Avatar, ideas for characters or dynamics between characters and animals and stuff. And there was like 800 pages. And so they were in binders, but he sat down with us and it was like, we went through almost every idea and page. And so that really opened up our minds. But what I'm not really remembering is, did that come first, or did it, at one point, he sent us, meaning us and the other two writers, Josh Friedman and Shane Salerno, off to come up with ideas and then present them to, so the four of us, and we presented them on whiteboards when he came in.
Yeah.
And that was exciting because there were new ideas there that he hadn't thought of. But what was very exciting was that there were ideas that he had thought of that he hadn't shared with us. And I remember he was standing, he walked in, he goes, okay. And for example, the Quaritch, for lack of a better description, the super posse that he ends up with, we all of us, I don't know which one of the four of us, but all of us, that was one of the things we pitched him, but he'd already had that idea. So he said, Quaritch super posse, check. And then he just went down other things that we'd come up with, which had indicated to us in some ways that there was already a mind meld starting to happen, with the five of us, which just got stronger and stronger as the room went on. But I don't think there was any like one specific thing that.
I do want to say though, that when he came in with those pages of ideas that he'd had between the two Avatar movies, it was mind blowing. I mean, we started like giggling because we just couldn't believe
how fun it was.
Well, how fun it was and how big, how many ideas there were. And then it quickly became apparent that one of the main jobs that we had in this room, which lasted about 6 months, was to try and wrangle these ideas into 3 movies. And there were so many of them and there was so much that this, it's a huge challenge. I mean, if you watch this movie, just 2, you see how big it is and how it escalates kind of naturally and the kind of the wonder of these new characters and worlds. But it gets much bigger from like, he's just getting started. So, so that's was one of the main things we worked on.
But, I did come up in the room. I mean, it wasn't like we just, and by the way, sometimes ideas would come up. And one of the great things about Jim is that he, I've said this before, but he's like tireless and fearless. And he instilled that in us from the very beginning. And so sometimes one of us would come up with an idea and pitch it to the room. And he would say, most times, not sometimes he would say, no, that's not, I don't like it. But sometimes he'd say, well, let's talk about that. Let's go down that road. And we would just, pound that idea. I mean, to study it, look at it, go with it, run with it. Where would it go? What's the drawbacks? What are the good? And we would, vet that idea on and on and on. And then eventually it made it into it, or we just let it go. If it didn't fit, it didn't fit. But anyway, it's funny. We've been writing together a long, long time. And to this day, a lot of times we'll say, wait a minute, was that my idea? Or was that your idea? We can't remember. It's the same with the room. But it is Jim, but just to be clear, Jim's movie from the beginning to where it is now. I mean, it's, the ideas that he came in with were, like Amanda said, just kind of mind blowing.
We all contributed, and he was very generous and open, and happy to collaborate. He's a great collaborator. But it does feel like we're midwives in a way.
Some ways, yeah.
You mentioned the sheer excess of ideas in the writer's room for these Avatar sequels. That explains something I've been told about these movies and The Way of Water. Am I right in thinking the first draft and your initial outline of how The Way of Water was going to unfold, you ended up breaking that movie in 2, right? So a decision was made to move a lot of elements from that first draft into Avatar 3. Obviously, we've got to be careful here about spoiling the films ahead, as I understand that things have been repurposed for Avatar 3 and beyond. But is there anything you can tell me about what that first draft looked like, what the sort of different beats were, different characters, anything like that? Talk me through what changed as best you can, guys.
When we came into the writer's room, the job was 3 movies. We were going to break down this material into 3 distinct movies, each with a beginning, middle, and end, but that would launch a saga. So it is also one continuous saga. And we didn't know who was going to have what movie, because it was Rick and I, Josh Friedman, and Shane Salerno were the kind of the 3 writing groups. And we didn't know who would have which movie, but all of us together in the room beat out all 3 of the movies. And this started in July. By Christmas time, Jim kind of assigned us our different movies. And we got the first movie, but there was a lot of material in there. And the burden on the first movie is also to launch the story. So, you have to establish that the first act of the first movie was the hardest. I mean, we banged our heads against the wall, all of us, in beating it out, because you really had to, define the new normal. What is Pandora like these years later? You have to establish all the characters in the Sully family, Quaritch returning. I mean, there's just a lot to get on the table, a lot of complicated stuff. From Quaritch's, becoming blue, he and his posse, to Kiri and the provenance, like how she's born out of Grace's avatar. The first script was the outline for it, which was very detailed. We weren't pulling any surprises, but the script, as pages started being created by us and by Jim, was very, very long and unwieldy because it had too much stuff in it. So Jim has said that we pulled something. Well, Jim called us one day and he said, look, I'm going to create, 2 has got to be 2 movies. It's just too much for 1 movie. And so in figuring out how to do that, one of the things we did was we pulled something. Jim said we pulled it raw and bleeding, out of A2. I can't tell you what it is, but it's in A3 now. And there are other kind of
things did shift back and forth.
It has to, because each movie has to have a reason for being. It has to feel distinct and complete, as I was saying. So there was some shuffling that had to be done at that point.
But there was a freedom, because first of all, to back up. So we all wrote on each treatment for each of the 3 movies, original movies. Mm-hmm. We did the movie 1 or 2 first, and then did it consecutively over time. Not like, this week, Monday we're going to write 2, by Thursday we're going to write 3. It wasn't like that. It was like it was over time. By the time we wrote as a group the treatment for the last film, we were really cooking with gas, as they say. We knew each other's moves. We knew exactly how to present it, and knew the beats. And we've been living with these characters in the story for 6 months by the time we wrote that last one. So, but the first one was kind of our first foray into writing as a group. And so the original pages, we knew it was going to be long.
Well, we were getting to know the characters, right?
Yeah.
I think in some of the original pages, it was the kids in the ruins talking to each other, discovering, and so all of a sudden, there's Kiri's voice, slow up,
And the culture, we were getting to understand the culture. Yeah. It was very cultural. Anyway, so the truth is, though, we talked to Jim, and he says, man, this is all great, but it's really going to be way long. And so we asked Jim, so, well, should we start cutting now? Should we start back on page 1? Like, let's just do the first 40 pages and try to get it down. And he said, he thought about it. And then he said, no, let's just go for it. Let's not, we spent all that time on this material. Let's see what we've got. And so that's how we ended up with this gigantic kind of, epic for the first movie. So, but anyway, though, it worked. I mean, it's only Jim can do. It's like when he called us and said, no, we're gonna make it 2 films.
But don't you feel like 3 is epic as well?
Oh my God. just wait. Yeah. No.
And then 4, I mean, it's
they're all epic. Yeah. But,
it's a lot. It's a lot of.
I mean, we actually
sounds like
tried.
it.
We even tried once he said that. We said, well, give us a month and we'll try to get these 2 down to 1, I think, at one point. And we did. And we wrote a script that was, and he read it.
We had to kill a lot of
we
stuff.
had to kill a lot of things. And he basically is, and again, incredibly supportive and generous. And he basically said, like, I love a lot of what you did, but, we're going with 2 movies. We're putting all.
I miss
this and I miss that. I understand why you got it, but so anyway. But
what was the hardest thing to kill, guys?
Well, the truth is we can't
tell you.
Because they may come back. They've probably been shifted along into one of the subsequent movies. Okay.
There was a moment where Jim went off and wrote. Are we allowed to talk about the
script that didn't.
The script that didn't get made?
Yeah, because he talked about it publicly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jim went off and he was like, wait, he took like 10 days and he went off and he wrote a whole script. And some amazing stuff in it. But it basically would have created yet another movie before the saga even launches. So he just threw the whole thing away.
He had to. It was an idea that came from the process of setting up the world and the RDA returning, and this idea came up that I don't want to get into, but Jim loved it. And so we went down that road, and we argued back and forth whether it fit. And that's when he said, no, I love this. I want to, I'm going to go off and write it. And he wrote an entire script. And by the way, it was great. It was like mind blowing Jim Cameron stuff in there.
The thing is that everybody knows Jim Cameron is brilliant on the screen. Right. But very few people know how brilliant is he on the page. I don't know. Maybe his scripts are published and people read them and everything.
But he was a writer before he was a director, and he considers himself a writer, and he is. And anyway, but he just felt like, I guess we all did, but he felt like as great as the script was, it just didn't fit in the story we were telling. It just didn't, wasn't going to be part of it.
Because there's this balance between moving the story forward and keeping it so dynamic and compelling, which he does, but also fondling the details. And I think people don't necessarily think of Jim Cameron as a character-based storyteller, but he absolutely is. That's really, I think, the secret sauce, right? I mean, it's unabashedly emotional. People care about the characters. People care desperately what happens to them, and within and then within that, there's this incredible visual storytelling that works together with the characterizations. So it's that mix, it's that combination of the two.
Guys, let's dive into some scenes. Like we start the film with Jake bringing us up to speed on how he and Pandora have changed over the 14 years or so since the first film. How early on did you land on this idea that Jake and Neytiri were going to be parents in this one, and that instead of meeting them again as these warriors kind of willing to die for their cause, nothing to live for in a way beyond their cause, now they were going to have a family, and that was going to bring complications. They had something to protect.
Well, that was an idea that Jim brought into the room. They were, he came in basically with a family structure, didn't he?
Absolutely. Yeah. But I'm really glad that you put it the way you did, because this idea of Jake and Neytiri as fearless warriors who were madly in love with each other, but now they're parents. And so they have everything to lose. And there's a different kind of fear, a hugely different challenge for them. And when the RDA comes back. So I think that was
the idea,
the basis for it. And we always, like, our first beachhead was, okay, we'll start with date night. Not only are Jake and Neytiri married with this family, which, by the way, we need to kind of introduce one by one because it's complicated with an adoption and then Spider as a kind of wannabe adoption. But you've got two parents who need to get out on their Ekron and break away because they've got these needy kids at the house. And so you want to make them relatable. Like, you want people in the audience to feel like, oh, I get that. they're just like us.
Well, when we first had kids, we had to basically carve out, almost with draconian measures, a date night. Like Saturday night, I don't care. The house is on fire. We're going out, dinner and a movie. And so that kind of thing was brought into it. So there was that. Yeah. The other thing too, that I think Jim has said this, but it's true, is that they are fearless warriors, as you say, and now they're terrified. They're terrified. Jake is desperately trying to keep his family together, keep his kids alive. Neytiri's terrified that they're gonna, she's losing her clan, and she's terrified of losing her kids. And so that was also part of the thing that Jim brought into it. So it's like, let's, anyone who's ever raised teenagers knows it's a scary business. So he has a family, a large blended family. And he and his wife, Susie Amos, are, very dedicated to each other and to the family. And so he brought all that into it at the top.
And you mentioned Spider there. I find it so interesting that in the midst of everything else that's going on in this film, you have this almost Mowgli-like character who, over the course of the film, is going to start to become torn between nature versus nurture, the Na'vi tribe who essentially raised him, and the human blood that runs in his veins. Actually, when we were talking about Caesar from Apes at the beginning there's a little bit of overlap that it occurred to me. How did the character of Spider come to be? What was so fascinating to you guys about the idea of dropping in this orphaned addition to the family?
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I can think of two things right off the bat. One is it's, well, a lot of things really. One of the first things we all responded to was kind of the wish fulfillment, because everyone was so in love with Avatar and this idea of Pandora and the Na'vi, and wouldn't it be cool to drop a human boy into that, and not a human who's going to try to kill, burn down home tree or whatever, but someone who just wants to be part of it. It's kind of so he is very much a Mowgli character. So we all really responded to that. And also too, it's just a fascinating, he's a fascinating character because he is very much caught between two worlds at the top, although, he really feels like he's part of the Sully family. And, but then once you introduce Quaritch as his father, who reappears, then it takes on a fascinating kind of pull away from the only family he's really known. But it's very primal, it's in his DNA. So there was all the Spider stuff, but then the other thing that we loved about it was how it humanizes Quaritch in a way. Yeah. From the first movie to this movie. It's like you really feel like, oh my God, now this is a whole side of this character that we didn't see in the first movie, even though he's still very much Quaritch, other than the fact that he's blue, and 10 feet tall. But you can tell that he's also torn. And so then over time, we realized too, thematically, how solid it all was, because it's so much, the movie's so much about family and fathers and sons and parents and children. And so I don't know, it really started to gain momentum before we ever actually sat down and started writing it.
And it brought forward other kind of deep themes in the movie, like this idea of, just the tension between Neytiri and Spider.
Yeah.
And so Spider's human and Neytiri, can the different species get along? We're very interested in this through
everything,
apes, and but racism plays into it. So can Neytiri accept Spider even though he's pink? And what kind of shame does Spider have about his pinkness?
Pink is in quotes. I mean, that's what she says in the movie.
That's what she says in the movie.
That's so interesting, because the same idea comes up when we get to the Met Hyena and that whole segment of the film. The Na'vi is not one big homogenized, mass. There's evolutionary differences between those guys, and there's also cultural differences, and it comes out in this conflict. I've got to ask though, before we get into that segment of the film, we've touched on Quaritch. I had to stifle a cheer when I realized the way you were bringing him back, and the sort of beauty of giving this guy who hated the Na'vi a second life in the body of one, and now he's hell-bent on revenge. Was there a Eureka moment when you realized that you were going to be able to bring him back, and that was the way to do it? Or how did his character come to be in this movie?
Again, Jim came in with this idea.
Yeah.
He had seen it, and so he told us how he was going to do it, and he'd already figured out the soul drive and the way the Selfridge, moment, so Quaritch had downloaded his soul drive in case he died ahead of time. But it was in the room that we, I think, figured out technically how to get that across and how to bring the audience in. And in particular, the scene at the ruins where Quaritch comes and he sees, his own death, and he comes across his own remains there, and he's got his skull. Yeah. And Quaritch processing his human death and separating himself from that human was just a huge dramatic turn, and also bringing back, because there's also Neytiri's feather.
That's right.
On her arrow, right? So then you have this idea, it's really the visualization of the idea for the audience, for Quaritch, and also for the kids. Because their Spider, Kiri's mom killed Spider's dad, right? In the last movie.
And from the kids, from Sully's kids, it's like mom killed Spider's dad. I mean, there's a lot going on in that scene. So, but it's a really good question, because that's a great example of Jim coming into the room with an idea, and some of it had been figured out. But then I wouldn't say there was a Eureka moment, because, to be honest, when he first presented an idea, there was, by the way, I think there was like a long pregnant pause from the four of us when he brought us, and we just kind of like,
how is that going to work? What is that going to look like?
And I mean, will the audience buy it? There was a lot not said in that moment that we were all kind of thinking at the same time. But it was, again, once you get into it and kind of just commit to it and roll with it, then a lot of the complexity from that decision, as things you were talking about, really started to emerge. And
what would it be for Quaritch and the Recoms to discover Pandora in their blue bodies? So you get kind of the reverse of what happened to Jake, or an echo of what happened to Jake in Avatar 1. But what's your rooting interest? It's interesting because the audience, you're getting some satisfaction out of them, taking off their boots and running barefoot and getting their Ekron. But on the other hand, you don't want to be empowering Quaritch. So it's a great kind of dramatic complexity, I think, that the audience is so involved in that.
Spider being captured following one of the film's many brilliant action sequences. Jake and his family, they realize that they have to kind of go into exile to protect the rest of the clan, aware that kind of Quaritch might be able to extract their whereabouts from Spider. So they end up going to join the Metcaina, the reef people, who with whom we'll spend a lot of this movie. The Sullys being by the ocean opens up the story to this really fascinating thread about the hunting of these whale-like creatures. Again, apologies if you're listening, James, because I'm going to mispronounce this. The Tulkun, I believe.
No, you got it.
Oh, okay, that's good. One of the kids, Loak, befriends one, and this whale in particular has been made an outcast from the pack. It turns out that the humans colonizing Pandora have begun killing these creatures because the tissue from their brains can be harvested for its anti-aging properties. It's something that's in keeping with what James was exploring in the first film with unobtainium. Human greed and that insatiable lust for profit, to go back to our earlier conversation about the threads between your films, it seems to be kind of a recurring thing that you return to, and it always leads to violence. In Jurassic World, despite the events of the previous films, the park was open because there was a buck to be made. Can you talk to me about the development of this whole sequence and that message that's alive in James's films and it's alive in yours, that our greed can be our downfall as a species?
I would go even further to say that in many ways, we are the bad guys. I mean, if you look at the history of the human race, the destruction we've left behind, going back probably to the Neanderthals, I guess. I don't know. So there's that. But but yeah, capitalism, it's just, it happens all the time. And just this morning I read an article that Exxon Mobil
I saw this.
was way ahead of understanding and researching global warming. I mean, they in many ways, their research was the best research in the world. And yet, what did they do with this information?
This is years ago.
Yeah, this was years ago.
Right? Yeah, I read the same piece.
I just read it this morning. But anyway, and and then they, of course, they went through this whole process of trying to cover it up or misrepresent the information so that it wasn't that bad. But ultimately, it was about their stock price. So, why do we do that?
When we were researching apes, people kept keeping it very secret and denying that they still had primates in cages.
Yeah, we called universities to say, hey, we're working on a movie. We didn't tell them it was Planet of the Apes. We say, we're working on a movie, da, 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 da. And this one person said, well, we don't have any primates here. It's not, it's just, it's falling. By the way, this was a doctor at a major university, research student. And I went, oh, God, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. He said, no. And but this is why I said, what do you have? We tried to have a conversation. And then, of course, like 2 weeks later, there's this big thing that, there was a big protest because they had primates in their lab. The guy just come right out and said, no, we don't have any. So anyway, I don't know. Again, we can't speak for James, but for us, it's just, again, it's one of those things where it's not what we really set out to do. We're not political flag wavers per se, but we want to tell a really good story and about characters that audiences can, get into and pull for and such.
But we want to tell stories that have meaning.
Well,
so that's always kind of the.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah, just for your screenwriting listeners, we do ask ourselves before we go into something, what's the point of making this movie other than to make money?
Why tell this story? Why tell this story now? What relevance does it have? What meaning does it have? Meaning, other than selling tickets. And we really don't write anything.
Not anymore.
We can't. I guess sometimes writers have to take a job. Certainly early in our careers, that was the case. But it's and I think that the audience, whether or not they know they're getting this message or whether or not that's why they're buying a ticket, they can smell if you're just kind of trying to sell the ticket and
if it's just pure commercialism, and sometimes it works but
there's a heedlessness and a voraciousness with which the human race is using up the resources around us, and we're in denial about it. And so you go to a movie like this and it reawakes your awe for what's right there in front of you. I mean, you could go to the movie and see what's on Pandora, or you could look out your window and you see the birds and the trees. But there's nothing like viscerally being in the character of a Tulkun, or the characters who love the Tulkun as their brothers and sisters, the Metkaina, to really understand that the whaling industry, which is alive and well, is something that is you could talk about it till you're blue in the face, but to see it,
it's a very apt phrase.
Yes,
that's funny.
To see it and to feel it is a much more powerful way to get those ideas across.
Yeah, and I think it really comes to bear there's a beat in that final action sequence that is so incredible, where the outcast whale is sort of smashing around in fury on the ocean floor, ready to kind of come to save the day. And I know it might sound silly, but that hits something primal for me. And the rage at the kind of current real life situation around climate and the oceans. Wow, it was such a good encapsulation of that.
Yeah, I love that, and I'll say it this way too. I think that maybe partially your response comes from the fact that you and we all know that greed is bad. We know that consumerism is helping destroy the planet. We know that it's not fair. It's actually ignorant in terms of what we're doing. but we feel like we can't do anything about it. I mean, it's just too big, you know, and the monster's just too big to defeat. And so a lot of us, you know, people do what they can in terms of their own footprints and so forth, or volunteering or whatever they can. But it's somewhere we all know that that's what's going on. And then if you can then give some kind of hope and outlet and you know, and entertainment, then, you know, I think it's,
and visualize what it is to fight it.
yeah, you can actually fight back. You know, with Caesar too, I go back to that. It's like, you know, when he stands up and says no, you know, that actually came, the germ of that came from just studying the old Planet of the Apes films from the 60s and 70s, because there was a mythology that the first ape who spoke said the word no. But what he's really saying also is that no to cages, no to research, not anymore, you know, which I think helped resonate with a lot of the audiences.
That action scene that we're kind of touching on, this entire segment is just pure adrenaline. There's so many layers to it. There's such musicality to it in the way that it moves through tempos right up into that crescendo at the end. What can you tell me about writing this scene and keeping everything trackable for the audience so cleanly when there's a kabillion things happening all at once, above the surface, beneath the surface? How did you approach it?
Well, first of all, I'm so glad you used the musical analogy, because it is kind of like a symphony, you know, and then you kind of escalate and you bring in instruments, but there's a lot of plate spinning going on. And so Jim says that there's 3 drafts. The first is the page. The second is when he directs it with his actors, and also, you know, with Weta, yeah. Which is another complex idea. And then the third is in the cutting room, right? So on the page, you know, one of the great things about Jim is that, and we do this too, is we keep, you know, we try to keep the action character based. So if something's happening, you want the audience to understand what's happening and how it's affecting the characters, how it's tightening the screws on the characters or liberating them, whatever the movement is emotionally, where it's coming. And so for that reason, that's building in a certain way. And then the action itself is building in a certain way. Now, this may change in the iterations through to cutting. But for the page, you want it to feel complete, like a great read. And all I can say is it's very complicated. You know, you have outlines and beats, you read it, you know, you print it out, you read it, you realize it's not building correctly. You realize you forgot that this thread that you were building over here, you forgot about it. It needs to be nurtured, or that it peaked too soon. So it is very detail-oriented work.
It's, for example, sometimes we'll just keep on a legal pad track of how many pages it's been since we saw Neytiri, for example.
Yeah.
Or since you know, we checked in with Spider, and then and those sequences, and then like you were saying, there's just so much going on. So a lot of it is just it's and Jim kind of kids me about this, but a lot of times it's just math. You know, it's just like arithmetic. And so, you know, a lot of times I just don't think the math is right in this sequence. And we'd look down at it and we'd break it down and say, well, okay, let's just make sure we do touch bases, and yet it's got to still kind of build in tension and build in tempo, but it's not always just, you know, like a rocket ship up in one direction. You've got to have downtime and give the moment of levity or a moment of a breather for the audience, and you kick back into it. And
it's so, like, you know, don't forget Neytiri is on deck, you know, handcuffed.
Yeah.
You know, keep your eye on that. So that happens on the page, even though in the editing room,
yeah, you
know, you have safety nets down the road.
Yeah.
But it has to work on first.
Yeah. And is this true? Is this what they're doing feel true and true to their character? And
well, they have this line or they have this moment. Is that equal to the moment?
Mm-hmm.
Is it underwhelming? Is it overwhelming? Is it, you know, it has to all come together. It is very complicated.
Yeah. And speaking of things coming together, we talked at the top of this about the main difference between the Jake we meet in the first film and the Jake we meet here is he's terrified. He's got something to lose and he's got a family to protect. And it's so interesting that we leave this movie with him having failed in that mission. He loses a child. Neytiri loses a child. And as an aside, wow, Zoe Saldana in that scene, like the sort of howls of grief. God, chilling. But yeah, can you tell me about like why it was that death had to happen and sort of different iterations of the script over time? Was there ever a version in which that death didn't take place, or what was the rationale?
We always knew Neytiri was going to die,
we did, yeah. And
we had to keep him a real character. He couldn't be just kind of a setup to die. You had to be surprised by his death. Well, the reason to kill him is that the stakes are real. It lets the audience know that the danger is out there, that we're willing to go there. It's good for it was very hard. It was very hard to kill him.
When we wrote the first time his death scene, we were sitting in this very room crying. Yeah, it was like, I can't believe maybe we can keep him alive.
You don't want to. You don't want to.
But part of it, I think, goes to the overall feeling of Avatar, and then bringing Quaritch back. One of the concerns that came from the room was, well, if we bring him back, will the audience think there's no real consequences in these films? He's dead, but now he's back. And so is everybody going to come back? And so anyway, the stakes has to be real, and you have to. And by the way, this is a saga; it's not just one film. So it's also it just keeps the emotional tension spinning into the next films as well. I also think, not to speak for Jim, but this idea then of the reconnection to Neytiri in that final
through Eywa,
and it's a way of reminding the audience just how powerful Eywa is and what a beautiful place Pandora is, and so I think that strategically also was a reason to
and it pushes. It does a lot of other things. It pushes Loak's story forward. The fact that he blames himself.
He's the one that said we've got to go back, and and so anyway, and there's this great shot. I don't know if you picked it up or not, because there's just so much to take in. But there's literal blood on Loak's hands at the end when Neytiri dies. Literally, there's blood on his hands, and and so it does feed into Loak's journey through these movies. I guess.
All of it, yes, Loak's and all of theirs too.
Yeah.
It's going to ripple.
Yeah, it's going to ripple. A lot of ripples.
The effect of his death is going to ripple forward.
When you describe those ripples, is there a darkness to come in Avatar 3 because of Neytiri's death? Like, presumably we now can't move forward without the repercussions of that tonally on the films to come. How would you describe Avatar 3 in terms of the consequences of where we leave things here?
I would say those ripples are there. You never forget Neytiri. However, and there's darkness to come, but there's also a lot of lightness and wonder, an amazing adventure. So I know I'm sorry I can't be more specific with you. I always sound like I don't know, P.T. Barnum when I try and describe the next movies to come, because it's just so big. But there's a lot of excitement and fun to be had as well.
Surprises too,
A lot of surprises.
But I don't know, these interviews are not the great safety net for being interviews. If you ask something really difficult, we can just simply say, we can't talk about it because it's in the next movie.
Is the same true, just because we've talked about it so much over the course of this conversation, is the same true about the new Apes movie, which I believe you guys wrote the screenplay for that? Am I right in thinking?
Well, actually, it's cool what happened. We weren't actually available to write the screenplay. And so Josh Friedman, who worked with us on the Avatar movies, wrote the screenplay, and we were producers on it, and we developed it with him and with Wes Ball, the director, and then Joe Hartwick Jr. is Wes's producing partner, and just by the way, Jason Reed, who produced Mulan, which we wrote, is now also involved, and so it's a great creative team. But anyway, so we're very excited about it. We're about less than 3 weeks away from finished shooting, and it's very, very exciting. And it's funny. I don't really know. We had an interview with, and one of the Disney executives was PR executives was listening in, and we started to talk about Apes, and she's like, no.
Well, like, not that we couldn't talk about, I couldn't reveal.
We can't reveal what's happening, but it's fun. We were at a function yesterday. Joe Neytiri, who runs Weta, and he's, those guys are geniuses. They do, luckily for us, all the Apes movies and Avatars. But we were talking him through the story yesterday because he hadn't read the script yet. And anyway, he got really excited, which then really got us excited. So,
the thing is, Caesar was definitely the glue, as you might imagine, for the reboot. So now that Caesar's gone, we had to figure out a new way to begin the story. And I really think we figured.
Yeah, we've got a great way into it. It's exciting. New characters, and not exactly. I've read some stuff online. I try not to read too much of that, but in terms of speculation about, But at any rate, I think people are going to be surprised in how we've approached it.
I can't wait, and I'm obviously really excited for those future Avatar movies as well. I should say as well, Amanda, I've noticed over the course of our conversation, you have the best mug I've ever seen on one of these calls. I love the hand rock. Oh my God, I think it was the first movie of yours I saw.
Yeah. Did you see the...
Yeah, there it is. Shut the fuck up. I'm trying to watch The Hand That Rocked the Cradle.
By the way, that was just something that we found online.
That existed already.
I didn't use that for an interview. That's bad.
I gave you the thing. The thing is, we're writers, so we would never really get swag on any. We've written all these movies. We don't get anything unless we find it online. And we do have coffee mugs, pretty much one for each of our movies. And at any rate, so we found that one online. It's like, oh my God, someone made that up, and there it is.
Well, I hope there's many more movies and therefore coffee mugs to come. Guys, thank you so much for this. This has been an absolute blast, and congrats again on Avatar: The Way of Water.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Had a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
It's been great talking to you.
You've been listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.